Welcome to a quiet night of ghostly tales. As the world slows down, we'll drift through haunted places and restless spirits, carried softly by stories meant to guide you into sleep. Do you believe ghosts are echoes of the past, or something still watching us now? Let me know your thoughts, and together, let's step into the whispers of the unknown. The city had been dying for a long time before they called it abandoned. Streetlights flickered like tired eyes. Buildings leaned against one another for support, and the fog rolled in thick enough to muffle even the sound of your own breath. But every night, one train still left the old central station, its steel body groaning through the silence. Train 113, the last train out of the city. I've been its conductor for 3 years. Nobody really knows why the government kept it running after everything closed down. Maybe it was for evacuation. Maybe it was something else entirely. I just knew my job was to show up at 11 p.m., punch in, and drive the route exactly as written. No questions, no deviations. There's a list of rules taped to the console of the cabin. I used to think they were a joke, some leftover superstition from the old conductors. But the longer I've been here, the less I laugh at them. The first rule says, never leave the cabin during stops. The second, never look at the passengers through the reflection in the cabin glass. And the third, always stop at all 5 stations, even if there's no one waiting. I never understood why those rules mattered until the night the city went completely dark. That night, the station was emptier than usual. No announcements, no maintenance workers. Just the echo of dripping water and the faint hum of electricity that didn't seem to come from anywhere. I walked down the platform, my footsteps ringing louder than they should. The digital clock above the tracks blinked in and out of existence, stuck between seconds. Inside the train, everything felt heavier. The air was colder, the seats dustier than the night before. I remember brushing my hand across the control panel, the metal biting my skin like ice. The radio crackled once, then fell silent. Usually dispatch checked in before departure. But that night there was only static. I called out, half expecting a response. None came. So I followed procedure. Doors closed, power engaged, and the train shuddered to life with a deep metallic sigh. We rolled out of a central station, past empty platforms and dark tunnels that smelled faintly of rust and rain. I used to hum to myself to keep the silence away, but that night, every sound I made echoed back, slightly delayed like the tunnel was repeating me. At the first stop, Ashmere Junction, I expected no one. The platform lights flickered weakly, casting shadows that didn't seem to match the pillars they came from. Then movement. A man in a long gray coat stepped forward, face hidden under a hat. He boarded without a word, without eye contact, holding a small leather bag to his chest. 2 more followed, a woman clutching a child and an old man with his head bowed. None of them looked up, none spoke. I punched their tickets mechanically, though I couldn't remember seeing them before. The moment the doors closed, the child began humming a tune I didn't recognize, something slow and sorrowful. As the train moved again, I glanced into the cabin glass, checking the reflection of the aisle behind me. For a split second, I thought I saw more people than had boarded, rows of faces, pale and still, watching me through the reflection. I blinked, and they were gone. Only the 3 passengers remained, quiet as statues. I tried to shake it off. Maybe my eyes were just tired. Maybe the dim lights played tricks on me. Still, I caught myself glancing at the rules again. Never look at the passengers through the reflection. I reached up and tore the note off the console, crumpled it into my pocket, pretending it didn't bother me. The fog outside thickened as we neared the second stop. The headlights barely pierced it, creating an illusion of movement even when we slowed to a crawl. My hands tightened around the throttle, a nervous habit. Through the radio, a burst of static hissed, and for a moment, I thought I heard a voice whisper my name. I didn't respond. Dispatch lines were often unstable this far out, Still, the voice had sounded too close, too deliberate. We reached Hollow Street Station. The clock on the platform was frozen at 12:14, its pendulum twitching uselessly. The platform was empty, or so I thought. The mist parted slightly, revealing someone standing near the edge, a woman wearing a long dress that shimmered faintly in the dim light like it was wet. She didn't move as the train came to a halt, but when the doors opened, she stepped inside, slow and deliberate. She didn't carry a ticket, didn't say a word. Her eyes met mine briefly, gray, hollow, and strangely distant. Then she walked down the aisle and sat near the back. I told myself she was just another passenger, maybe a late traveler heading out of the city. But something about her presence made the air colder. The other passengers didn't even glance at her. The child stopped humming. The train itself seemed to groan as if it didn't want to move again. The monitor beside me flickered, showing a brief distortion. For half a second, it displayed a face I didn't recognize, staring directly into the cabin camera. Then it cut to black. I tapped the screen. Nothing. I turned the throttle again, forcing the train forward through the fog, trying not to think about the silence behind me. Each click of the wheels against the track sounded slower, heavier, like the train carried more weight than before. When I checked the passenger log on my screen, there were 4 names listed. I counted 3 when we left the station. The number blinked on the monitor, 4 passengers. My stomach turned as I double-checked the log. 3 tickets had been collected, yet the system recorded an extra entry, time-stamped exactly when the woman in the soaked dress had stepped aboard. The name field read simply, unregistered. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't static. A voice, faint and uneven, came through, whispering like breath across glass. "Keep moving! Don't look back!" I froze, staring at the receiver, but the signal died as quickly as it came. My heart pounded against my ribs as the sound of the train filled the silence once more. The rhythmic thud of metal wheels echoing down the tunnel like a heartbeat. I told myself to focus. I had a job to do. I kept my eyes on the track ahead, but the fog outside seemed to swirl with shapes, faces, hands reaching toward the train as we passed. They looked solid one moment and dissolved into mist the next. Every time I blinked, they seemed closer to the windows. When I looked down at the speed gauge, it was dropping on its own. The brakes hissed without me touching them. The train was slowing down in the middle of nowhere. "Control, this is Conductor 113, I said, pressing the radio button. "I'm experiencing a system malfunction between Hollow Street and Glassmore. Do you copy?" A pause, then static, then something else. A faint hum, low and steady, almost like someone breathing just beside the speaker. I released the button and stared into the reflection of the glass again, half hoping to catch my own frightened face, half dreading what I might see. For a second I saw nothing but the dimly lit cabin behind me. Then, as if the fog inside the glass cleared, I saw the seats. They were full, every one of them. Dozens of passengers sat in silence, their faces pale and motionless. Their eyes glowed faintly, like the reflection of distant lights. My throat tightened. I turned around instantly, but when I looked back, the car was nearly empty again, just the 3 passengers I had seen before, plus the woman in the dress. She was still staring out the window, her lips slightly parted as if she were whispering to someone unseen. I gripped the controls harder, trying to convince myself it was all imagination, that the exhaustion and isolation were finally getting to me. The lights above flickered again. Then the intercom clicked on by itself. "Next stop, Glassmore Station," a voice announced. But it wasn't the automated recording I knew. It was my own voice, recorded, distorted, looping slightly at the end. The echo made my skin crawl. The woman in the dress stood up. Her reflection didn't follow her. It stayed seated, watching me. I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend I didn't see. But my hands were trembling so badly the controls slipped slightly under my grip. When we arrived at Glassmore, the station lights were unusually bright. almost blinding after so much darkness. I expected the woman to leave, but she didn't move. The doors opened, steam spilling into the car, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement on the platform, a crowd standing still, their bodies faint outlines in the mist. The child pointed toward the window and said very softly, "They can't leave." I turned, startled, but his mother pulled him close, whispering something I couldn't hear. The doors closed. The train lurched forward. That was when I noticed the smell. Faint at first, like wet earth and iron, but growing stronger with every passing minute. It was the smell of rain on old metal, or blood. I checked the gauges again. The weight indicator showed another anomaly. The train had grown heavier by almost a ton, yet no one new had boarded. My hands shook as I reached for the cabin log. The screen updated on its own. Passenger count, 5. The 5th entry had appeared. No name this time. Just a single word blinking slowly across the screen. Returned. My breath caught. I could feel the hairs on my arms rising, the air inside the cabin turning cold enough to frost the corners of the glass. I didn't dare look behind me, not after what I'd seen earlier, but I could feel it, the faint shift of air, the sense of someone standing just behind my seat. I stared straight ahead, refusing to turn. The radio hissed softly again, and through the noise a familiar whisper came. "Don't stop. You're almost through the living part of the line." Then silence. I don't remember breathing for a while after that. Just the endless clatter of wheels against the track and the hollow sound of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. Outside, the tunnels changed. They weren't lined with brick anymore. The walls looked uneven, rough, almost like the insides of a cave. The lights flickered over strange markings, symbols scratched into the stone, spiraling patterns that seemed to pulse as we passed. The child started humming again, that same slow, sorrowful tune. Only this time his voice was joined by others, faint at first, then swelling in a low chorus that filled the car. I knew then that I wasn't driving through any ordinary tunnel. I was carrying them somewhere else, somewhere the living weren't meant to go. The chorus grew louder, yet strangely hollow, as if each note carried a memory rather than sound. The child's eyes were wide, reflecting the dim light, and his tiny fingers tapped nervously against the seat in rhythm with the unseen voices. The other passengers remained still, but I could feel the air around them thickening, like the fog outside had seeped into the car itself. I gripped the throttle and whispered to myself, trying to anchor reality. "It's just a sound. It's just a sound. Keep driving." But the train didn't respond the way it should. The control panel flickered, lights blinking in a pattern that wasn't normal. Gauges swung wildly, the speedometer darting from 0 to 50 and back again. The doors to the next car slammed shut on their own, though no one was near them. Then the woman in the dress turned her head slowly toward me. Her eyes were dark, endless pools that seemed to draw the dim light out of the cabin. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Just the echo of the chorus intensifying, filling every corner of the train. I pressed my hands against the throttle, trying to keep the train steady. I glanced down at the passenger log again. 4 names had become 6. 2 unregistered entries had appeared. No one had moved, yet somehow they were there. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the extra passengers weren't seated. They hovered slightly above the floor, their forms transparent, barely more than shadows of human shape. I blinked, and they were gone. My stomach turned as the weight indicator registered them anyway. The train rattled over an unseen bump in the track, throwing my chest against the controls. I could hear whispers now, soft and insistent, brushing against my ears like fingers. "Don't stop. Don't look back. Don't leave." I wanted to scream, to abandon the train entirely, but I remembered the rules. Never leave the cabin, never look through the reflection. Always stop at every station. I had broken none yet. and somehow I knew I had to keep moving. The fog outside turned thick, almost tangible. Shapes began appearing in the tunnel, small figures at first, shadows darting just beyond the beam of the headlights. They moved in silence, hovering, walking, some crawling along the tunnel walls. My throat tightened. The lights flickered, and in that moment, I caught a glimpse of them in the glass. The reflection of the cabin, filled with faces, pale and unblinking, all staring at me, waiting. I forced my gaze back to the track. Forward. Just forward. The intercom clicked again. My own voice returned, distorted, repeating over and over, "Do not stop. Do not stop. Do not stop." I slammed my palm over the speaker, but it continued beneath the pressure of my hand, the rhythm of my heartbeat aligning with the repeated words. The child leaned forward suddenly. His lips barely moved as he whispered something I couldn't hear. The woman in the dress swiveled toward him, her head tilting unnaturally. The seats around her seemed to stretch and twist, elongating in impossible angles. I gripped the throttle tighter. When we reached Hollow Street Station again, I noticed the platform had changed. It wasn't the empty, abandoned platform I had stopped at earlier. It was alive with motion, or at least a simulation of it. Shadows moved along the walls, flickering images of people who had once waited for trains that never came. Some waved at me, some stared blankly, others dissolved into smoke before I could get a clear look. I glanced at the passenger log again. 7. Another unregistered passenger had appeared. My fingers were trembling too much to adjust the throttle properly. The train slowed slightly on its own, but I couldn't take my eyes off the reflection now. The cabin was full, completely full. The 3 original passengers, the woman in the dress, the child, the old man, and now shapes I couldn't identify. Every face pale, every eye fixed on me. I remembered the rule I had ignored earlier. Never look through the reflection. But it was impossible. The weight of all those eyes pinned me to the seat. Their presence pressed against my chest, thickening the air until it felt as though I was swimming in it. A sudden jolt threw me forward. The lights flickered violently, then went out. Pitch black filled the cabin. Only the whispers remained, louder now, circling me. Shapes brushed against my shoulders, passing through me with a coldness that burned. Then light returned. The train's cabin lights flickered back on, revealing the passengers as they were, and not as they were. The woman in the dress had grown taller, almost too tall, her head brushing the ceiling. The child's form flickered, fading in and out, his face morphing into an older version of himself. The old man's eyes were hollow, completely black. The others, those unregistered shadows, had become solid for a moment, staring with intent that felt both patient and eternal. My hands shook as I gripped the throttle. I didn't know if the train was moving forward or backward. Time seemed to have folded in on itself, each passing second stretching and bending. The intercom buzzed softly. "Forward. Keep moving. You are not alone." And then the first hint of the next stop appeared ahead, a faint glow in the darkness. I didn't know what I would find there. I only knew I had to keep the train moving, or something inside would reach for me, something that didn't want to wait. I swallowed hard and my chest tight with fear and anticipation. The fog swirled outside the windows, but inside the cabin, the weight of unseen eyes pressed closer with every heartbeat. I had no choice but to follow the rules, even if I didn't fully understand them, even if obeying them felt like stepping into the unknown. The next station loomed ahead. The journey was only beginning. The glow of the next station grew brighter, a pale, unnatural light cutting through the fog like a shard of ice. The outline of Glassmore Station emerged, though it didn't look like any station I had ever known. The platform seemed impossibly long, stretching far beyond the reach of the headlights. Shadows moved along the edges, bending and twisting, but they weren't human. They were echoes of people who had once waited here, each figure frozen in some fragment of life, a woman with her hand outstretched. A man mid-step, a child running. Their faces were blurred, impossible to focus on. Yet I could feel their attention on me, waiting, expecting. The train slowed, obedient to some unseen hand, and the doors opened with a hiss. The fog poured in, curling around the wheels, filling the cabin with a damp chill. I glanced at the passenger log, 8. Another unregistered entry had appeared. My stomach nodded as I realized the number of passengers was growing faster than anyone could possibly board. Some of the new figures weren't seated. They floated slightly above the ground, twisting in slow, unnatural motions. The child whispered again, softer this time. Words I could barely hear. "They're waiting for you." I froze. The woman in the dress turned her head slowly toward him. Her eyes, dark and endless, seemed to absorb the dim cabin light. She didn't move her lips, but the air itself seemed to carry a wordless message of warning. Outside, the shadows reached closer. One of them pressed against the window as if testing the glass, a skeletal hand sliding along the surface with impossible delicacy. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped the throttle, trying to force the train forward, but the wheels resisted, slowing as though the track itself was holding us back. The old man leaned forward, his black eyes fixed on me. For the first time he spoke, his voice low and uneven, barely audible over the hum of the engine. "It's not your choice anymore. You are part of the route now." A shiver ran through me, cold and insistent. I turned my head slightly, glancing at the reflection in the glass. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't resist. The cabin behind me was filled with faces, dozens, maybe hundreds, all staring, eyes wide, hollow, some glowing faintly. Their mouths moved in silent whispers, forming words I couldn't hear. Shapes pressed together, stretching into impossible forms, and for a moment, I thought I saw my own reflection among them. Not my current face, but a version of me I didn't recognize, older, hollow-eyed, trapped in that same cabin forever. I tore my gaze away and slammed my hands against the controls. Forward. I had to move forward. The intercom buzzed, faint and distorted. My own voice repeated, warped and overlapping. "Do not stop! Do not stop! Do not stop!" The train lurched as if protesting my insistence. The fog outside thickened to a solid wall. Shapes pressed against the windows, hands, faces reaching, silent but urgent. The chorus of voices inside the cabin rose, low and melodic, a sound both mournful and commanding. I couldn't tell which was real and which was memory, but the effect was the same. The weight of every soul in that car pressed down on me, a gravity stronger than steel or concrete. I glanced at the child again. His form flickered violently between boy and older man. He held out the toy train he had given me earlier, his tiny hands trembling. I took it instinctively, feeling the cold plastic bite into my palm. The intercom buzzed again. "Do not fail the line. Do not falter. Keep moving." As we neared the station, I noticed the tracks ahead were no longer steel. They shimmered faintly, translucent like glass, stretching into an infinite void. The fog curled around them, thickening with every inch, forming shapes that reached toward the train like fingers, warning or demanding. It was impossible to tell. The woman in the dress began to rise from her seat, moving slowly, eerily, her feet not touching the floor. The child's humming rose to match her ascent, and the old man's hollow gaze followed every motion. The other unregistered passengers shifted, some solidifying into full forms, some fading into mist. The cabin felt smaller, tighter, as if the very walls were pressing inward. I gripped the throttle with shaking hands, fighting against the impossible pull of the station. The train hesitated, wheels grinding softly against the unseen rails. I forced the engine forward inch by inch. The intercom crackled violently, my distorted voice screaming, "Forward! Keep moving!" And then the doors opened on their own. The platform was empty, yet somehow full. Figures moved in and out of the fog, indistinct, waiting for something I couldn't name. A single phrase echoed through the car, carried not by sound, but by the pressure in the air. The line continues. You belong here now. I swallowed hard, feeling the chill of inevitability creeping over me. I knew that the train, these stations, and the passengers were not just part of a route. They were part of a cycle, a living, breathing entity, and I was now tethered to it. One misstep, one glance through the glass, and I could vanish as easily as the others. The child placed the toy train on the control panel, and I noticed something horrifying. It began to move on its own, tiny wheels spinning in perfect rhythm with the train itself. The intercom whispered one final warning before going silent. I realized, in that frozen moment, that I had become part of something far greater than myself. The rules weren't just instructions, they were lifelines, the only protection against the unrelenting presence that surrounded us. As the train lurched forward into the darkness, leaving the unnatural glow of Glassmore behind, I understood the truth. I was the conductor of more than steel and wheels. I was the keeper of the last line out of the city, the guardian of a route that carried more than passengers. And some of those passengers were not alive. Every night, I repeat the same ritual, following the rules, counting the passengers, watching the reflections, listening to the whispers. Every night, I know that any mistake could be my last, that the train itself decides who leaves and who remains. And tonight, as the fog curls against the windows and the shadows stretch closer, I know one thing with absolute certainty. The journey has only just begun. The next stop was Hollow Street Station. I had learned to anticipate the strange with a quiet, tense vigilance, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited. The station appeared through the fog as if it had materialized from a dream. The platform was lit by dim, flickering lights that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. The walls were streaked with damp, the air thick and heavy with the smell of wet stone and rust. Everything felt slowed, as if the city itself had taken a deep, careful breath and held it for decades. I slowed the train gradually, pressing against the throttle to keep it steady. The doors opened with a hiss, steam curling into the car. Normally, I would expect no one to board here, but a movement caught my eye at the far end of the platform. A woman stood there, almost entirely still, wearing a wedding dress that looked as though it had been buried for years and recently unearthed. The fabric clung to her in wet, glimmering folds. She did not move as I rolled to a stop, yet the air around her seemed to hum with a silent insistence. The train door slid open. The woman stepped inside without hesitation. She didn't speak, didn't offer a ticket. She walked down the aisle with a grace that defied gravity, her eyes focused on nothing, yet somehow seeing everything. She stopped at the back of the car and sat down, folding her hands neatly on her lap. The three passengers from before remained seated, silent and still, as if they had expected her. The child's humming stopped. The old man's head tilted slightly toward the woman. I felt my stomach knot, a creeping realization that something impossible had just happened. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps she had been waiting on the platform all night. Perhaps she had boarded before, a passenger who had simply faded into the shadows until now. But a memory struck me with chilling clarity. Years ago, during a routine inspection of the city archives, I had read about a wedding that ended in tragedy on Hollow Street. A bride had vanished the night before her wedding. The details were vague, almost erased, but the records were clear. She had been found neither in the city nor in the surrounding towns. I swallowed hard and forced myself to check the passenger log. 4 registered names appeared. The new entry, unregistered, blinked on the screen, time-stamped precisely at the moment she had boarded. The word beside it was simple: unknown. I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling of dread and focused on moving the train forward. My hands gripped the controls, the cold metal biting through my gloves. The cabin lights flickered, and I glanced at the reflection once, just for a fraction of a second. A row of faces filled the glass behind me, pale and expressionless, their eyes fixed on me with a weight that pressed against my chest. I looked away immediately, forcing myself to obey the rule I had ignored too many times already. The train shuddered as we left the platform. Outside, the fog thickened, curling around the wheels and stretching forward in impossible shapes. Shadows moved along the tunnel walls, sometimes walking, sometimes crawling, always watching. My heart pounded with each turn of the wheel, each vibration of the track. I knew I was not alone, that this route carried more than bodies and memories. Then it happened. One of the original passengers, the man in the gray coat from Ashmere Junction, whispered a single word so faint I barely heard it. Her. I turned slightly, startled, but he was staring straight ahead as though frozen in place. I glanced back toward the woman in the wedding dress. She was still sitting, still silent, yet the air around her seemed to pulse, and for a brief instant, I thought I saw her outline blur and fade at the edges. I swallowed hard, gripping the throttle tighter. The intercom clicked on by itself, crackling with static. Then, clear enough to make my skin crawl, a voice whispered my name, soft and deliberate. It was neither the child nor the old man nor anyone I could identify. It was as if the train itself had spoken. I forced myself to look forward again, and the tunnel ahead seemed to stretch endlessly. The lights flickered, and the walls were no longer smooth concrete, but lined with strange, jagged indentations that pulsed faintly, almost like veins. I realized the tunnel was alive in some way, reacting to our movement. My heart raced. Suddenly I felt it. The shift in the air around me, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The man in the gray coat who had boarded at Ashmere Junction was gone. The seat he had occupied was empty. No sign of movement, no sudden lurch of the train, nothing to explain his disappearance. My pulse quickened. I glanced at the passenger log. 4 names still appeared. Only 4. Yet I knew he had been there just moments ago. A cold sensation ran up my spine. I felt eyes on me, not from the remaining passengers, but from the space where he had vanished. The cabin felt smaller, the air thicker, almost solid. The child whispered again, pointing toward the empty seat. His voice trembled slightly as he said, "They leave when they're meant to." I swallowed, my throat dry. I realized then that these disappearances were not accidents. They were rules being enforced by something beyond comprehension. Something that decided who remained and who vanished. Something that the train obeyed more completely than I could ever understand. The woman in the wedding dress turned her head toward the window, her reflection unmoving in the glass, and I felt a sudden, sharp fear. Whatever was guiding this train, whatever dictated the rules, it was watching me just as closely as I was watching it. The next stop approached. The fog thickened, curling along the rails and pressing against the windows like fingers. I knew I had to continue, to follow the path laid before me. The rules dictated it, the passengers expected it, and the train demanded it. My hands trembled as I prepared to enter the next station, wondering how many more would vanish before we reached the end of the line. The train slowed as it neared the next stop, though the platform ahead looked nothing like the stations I remembered. Hollow Street had changed again. The lights flickered violently, casting long shadows that stretched across the concrete, then disappeared before I could focus on them. The fog outside pressed against the windows, curling in swirls that resembled human forms, reaching toward the train as though urging it to stop, to release something. I pressed my hands against the throttle, forcing the train forward. The passenger log remained steady, 4 names, but my mind refused to accept it. One moment the man in the gray coat had been there, seated quietly, and the next he was gone, vanished without a trace. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, as though the train itself had swallowed him, and I could feel a subtle vibration beneath my feet, a pulse that seemed to echo the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The child leaned forward slightly, his small hand tapping the seat in front of him. He whispered again, soft but urgent. "They're waiting for the next stop." I could feel his words more than hear them, vibrating through the air, pressing against my chest. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing, knowing that whatever awaited at the station was not alive in any way I could comprehend. The woman in the wedding dress remained seated, motionless, though the edges of her form seemed to shimmer and waver, like she was caught between worlds. Her gaze, hollow and distant, was fixed on the window. I avoided looking directly at her reflection, remembering the rules that had kept me sane or alive so far. As we pulled to a halt, the intercom clicked again. Static at first, then the faintest whisper, barely audible. "Do not leave the cabin. Do not look. They are here." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It carried a weight, a certainty, that sent shivers down my spine. I pressed the button to respond, but my own voice seemed swallowed by the hum of the train, replaced by the same distorted echo I had heard at Glassmore. The doors opened with a hiss, and the fog outside spilled into the cabin, curling around the seats and reaching toward the passengers. I caught glimpses of movement, figures just beyond the platform lights, standing perfectly still, watching us. Shapes that resembled people but lacked warmth or substance. They didn't move as the train approached. They simply waited. I glanced at the child again. He had grown quiet, staring at the floor, fingers intertwined in his lap. Then he pointed toward the doorway. His whisper was almost lost in the hum of the engine. "They choose who stays and who leaves." My stomach nodded. I understood then that these disappearances were not accidents. They were decisions. The train did not merely carry passengers, it judged them, determined who could continue to ride and who would vanish into whatever void existed beyond the stations. I realized that the rules I had been following were more than instructions. They were lifelines, ways to navigate a system far beyond human understanding. The cabin grew colder. The fog that had entered seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin, seeping into my clothes, chilling my bones. I could feel it curling around the remaining passengers, brushing against them as though inspecting them. The woman in the dress shifted slightly, though she made no sound, and the child's small hand trembled in his lap. I forced myself to look forward down the endless stretch of track. The tunnel ahead twisted and narrowed in ways that defied logic, the walls lined with strange, jagged textures that seemed almost alive. Shadows moved across them, walking, crawling, stretching in forms that made no sense. I gripped the throttle harder, knowing I had to keep moving, that stopping was no longer an option. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate click, like a shoe tapping against concrete. I turned my head slightly, but the seat beside me was empty. My pulse quickened. The air seemed to thrum with expectation. I glanced at the passenger log. 4 names still appeared. The unregistered entries had vanished, but I knew they were still here, somewhere between the layers of reality, watching, waiting. The intercom crackled violently, a distorted echo of my own voice repeating, "Do not stop. Do not look. Do not fail the line." I swallowed hard and forced the train forward into the fog, into the unknown. The next station approached, and I knew that more vanishings would occur, more impossible events would unfold, and that the rules, though incomprehensible, were all that stood between me and the same fate as those who had disappeared before. The weight of the cabin pressed in, heavier with each passing moment. I realized that Hollow Street was not just a station, it was a trial, and I was the only one fully aware that survival depended on following rules I could barely understand, in a world that had long since ceased to follow the rules I knew. The train slowed as we approached Hollow Street Station again, though the platform had shifted once more, becoming something unrecognizable. The familiar concrete was replaced by cracked stone, slick with a sheen of moisture that reflected the dim, flickering lights. Shapes moved in the mist, figures that should not exist, standing frozen in mid-step. I felt a chill creep along my spine as the train glided to a stop, the hiss of the doors cutting through the fog like a warning. The cabin was silent, but the air vibrated with expectation. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing against me, cold and insistent. The passenger log remained steady, 4 names, but I knew more were here. Shapes brushed past the edges of the car, shadows that shifted and lingered just out of focus. They did not sit. They did not breathe. Yet I could feel their presence as tangibly as the cold metal of the throttle beneath my hands. I watched the woman in the wedding dress. She had risen from her seat, floating slightly above the floor. Her gaze was fixed ahead, hollow, distant, yet commanding. The child had grown still, his small hands clenched in his lap, staring at the empty space beside me. The old man's hollow eyes followed her every movement, as though he had known this was coming. I tried to focus on the track ahead, but the tunnel seemed alive, the walls undulating slightly, rippling as the train moved past. Jagged shapes etched into the stone pulsed faintly, almost as though the tunnel itself was breathing, watching, waiting. I forced myself to grip the throttle harder, trying to maintain control over something that felt increasingly beyond human handling. Then I felt it. A shift in the air behind me, subtle at first, then undeniable. The man in the gray coat from Ashmere Junction reappeared. He was seated again, perfectly still, yet I knew he had not been there a moment ago. His eyes, when they met mine, held a hollow certainty, a silent message I could not comprehend. The intercom clicked, a distorted whisper cutting through the cabin. "Do not look. Do not leave. Follow the line." My own voice repeated faintly beneath it, warped and echoing in a loop that made my teeth ache. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes forward, knowing that disobedience could be fatal. Outside, the fog shifted. Faces emerged for a brief moment, passengers long gone, shadows of the dead, some crying, some smiling, all watching as the train passed. Their eyes followed the light, some pressed against the glass, their features blurred and impossible. The weight of their attention pressed inward, filling the cabin with a sensation I could not name. The child spoke again, his voice trembling slightly. "They take what belongs to them. Some leave, some stay." I felt the meaning of his words before I understood them fully. These vanishings were not random. They were chosen, a selection made by rules that I could barely grasp. The woman in the dress stood, drifting toward the aisle as the train lurched. She didn't speak, didn't move like a normal person. Yet the air around her seemed to warp, stretching and pulsing as she moved. The old man leaned forward as though warning me silently. I felt the chill of inevitability close in, a tangible pressure against my chest. The passenger log shifted once more. 5 names now, the unregistered entry blinking on the screen. I counted the physical passengers. 3 original riders, the woman in the dress and the child. The old man sat still, but the system counted him separately. Another presence existed, unseen yet undeniable. I forced myself to grip the throttle, my knuckles white. The train jolted as it crossed a hidden bump in the track, a vibration that traveled through my body. The intercom whispered again, louder now, a chorus of distorted echoes. "Do not fail. Do not falter. The line continues." The fog outside thickened further, curling into the cabin, brushing against my skin, cold and damp. I could feel fingers tracing along my arms, shoulders back. But when I turned, nothing was there. The woman in the dress floated closer, her face still hollow, and I understood without a word that she was not here to leave, not here to board. but to ensure the line continued, to enforce rules I had no authority to question. The tunnel ahead narrowed impossibly. Shadows stretched along the walls, some walking, some crawling, some hovering in impossible angles. I forced the train forward, inch by inch, heart pounding, sweat cold against my skin. The child's humming began again, faint and sorrowful, weaving through the cabin like a melody of the lost. Then I felt it, a sudden sharp shift. The air behind me thickened, compressing the cabin. The man in the gray coat vanished again, leaving the seat empty. I knew I was being watched by unseen eyes, judged by entities that had existed before me and would likely exist long after. I swallowed hard and forced the train forward, through the fog, past the shadows, into the unknown. Hollow Street was not just a station. It was a test, a trial, a gate. And the train carried more than passengers. It carried souls, rules, and a purpose I could barely comprehend. The next stop approached. I knew with a growing certainty that more vanishings were inevitable. The rules were clear, but the consequences of breaking them loomed larger than any fear I had ever known. The air trembled around me as if anticipating the next moment, as if the train itself was alive and aware, and it demanded obedience. I braced myself for what came next, my hands tight on the controls, heart hammering, knowing that at Hollow Street, the line of the living and the dead blurred, and the train decided who remained, who vanished, and who was next. The train lurched slightly as we approached the end of the Hollow Street station, though it was no longer the station I had known. The platform had morphed into something unrecognizable. Cracked tiles stretched into impossible angles, and puddles reflected distorted, shadowy figures standing just out of focus. Shapes moved in the mist beyond the platform lights, frozen mid-step, yet their eyes seemed to follow the train as we slowed to a halt. The cabin felt heavier than ever. Air thickened, pressing against my chest, carrying whispers too faint to catch entirely, but insistent enough to make my skin crawl. The passenger log now listed 6 names. 4 were accounted for in the car. The remaining 2 were unregistered entries. I didn't dare look to see if the seats were occupied. My hands gripped the throttle, cold sweat slipping down my palms, and I forced myself to obey the rules. The woman in the wedding dress rose slightly above her seat, moving silently toward the aisle. Her edges flickered in and out of focus, like light caught on water, and a low hum seemed to resonate from her presence. The child began humming softly again, a sorrowful melody that twisted into something older, something I didn't recognize but felt deep in my chest. The old man's hollow gaze never wavered, his eyes tracking every movement in the car. Then I noticed the shift. One of the unregistered passengers, the one who had appeared as a shadow just moments before, began to solidify into a vague human form. It hovered slightly above the floor, indistinct but present, as if testing the limits of reality. I felt the chill crawl up my spine as it drifted closer to the remaining passengers. My throat went dry, but I kept my focus on the track ahead. A faint voice came through the intercom, layered over the distorted echoes of my own voice. "Do not stop. They are waiting. The line must continue." The words were clear, yet not directed at me alone. They carried weight, authority, and the kind that cannot be questioned. I swallowed, heart hammering, and pressed the throttle forward. Outside, the fog thickened, twisting around the train like living fingers. Figures moved in the mist. Passengers from other nights, perhaps, caught in some loop, appearing and disappearing in an endless cycle. Faces pressed against the windows, unblinking, hollow, pale. Their presence pressed into the car, their weight intangible but undeniable. The child pointed toward the empty seat where the gray-coated man had vanished moments ago. "They choose," he whispered, voice trembling. I realized then that vanishings were not random. The train, the stations, the fog, and the shadows, they all decided who would continue and who would be taken. The rules were not guidance, they were survival. The woman in the wedding dress floated to the back of the car, and the child leaned slightly forward, his voice blending with the hum of the train. Do not falter. The old man's black eyes followed her, and I felt a tension in the air, a pause, as if the world itself had stopped to watch what would happen next. A sudden lurch shook the train. The child's humming stopped abruptly. I glanced at the log. 6 names remained, but when I looked at the seats, the gray-coated man had returned. He sat silently, eyes hollow, expressionless. I didn't ask how. I didn't dare. The air seemed to pulse around him, as if his presence alone bent the space of the cabin. The fog outside thickened further, and the tunnel ahead narrowed impossibly. The walls lined with strange, jagged indentations that pulsed with light. Shadows danced along them, walking, crawling, bending in impossible ways. The intercom whispered again, "Do not fail the line. Keep moving. The route is not yours to change." I forced the train forward inch by inch. The cabin seemed to shrink with each heartbeat, air thickening as though compressing time and space itself. Every passenger, visible or unseen, pressed on me with a silent intent. I realized that Hollow Street was not just a station. It was a crucible, a test of obedience and endurance. The final shift came suddenly. The woman in the wedding dress turned her hollow gaze on me. I felt the air itself tense, a presence behind her pressing close. The intercom crackled violently, my own distorted voice overlapping with the whisper. Do not stop. Do not look. Do not fail the line. The fog outside twisted violently, shapes pressing against the windows. A soft tapping, almost like footsteps, echoed through the car, though no one moved. The child's hands trembled in his lap. The old man remained still, eyes hollow, expression unreadable. And then it happened. A presence brushed against my shoulder, cold as ice, brushing through my body, intangible yet tangible, impossible yet undeniable. One of the unregistered passengers, solidified fully, its form a pale mirror of a human, staring directly at me. The air around it shimmered, thick and alive. I realized in that instant, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that Hollow Street had claimed its first. The gray-coated man's empty seat had been a warning. Some vanishings were immediate. Some were gradual, testing, selecting, enforcing the rules of this train that carried more than passengers. The intercom whispered one final message before going silent. The line demanded continuation. The fog outside pressed closer, swirling with shapes and shadows, and I gripped the throttle, heart hammering, knowing that the journey through Hollow Street was far from over. The vanishings had begun, and I was still at the helm, the sole conductor of a train that carried the living and the dead, the vanished and the returned, along a line that obeyed only itself. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of inevitability settle over me. Hollow Street was a reminder, a test, and the beginning of the night's true trials. I knew the next stop awaited, and with it, the rules would demand more. More obedience, more attention, more life measured against the thin, unyielding line of the train. I had no choice but to follow, to drive forward into the fog, into the vanishings, into the unknown. The fog had swallowed Hollow Street behind us, but its presence lingered in the cabin like a scent that would not fade. I could feel the memory of that station clinging to the train, pressing against the metal walls, whispering through the vibrations in the floor. The tunnel ahead was darker than any before. The lights flickered and strained as though struggling to stay alive, and the hum of the engine deepened into something that almost resembled breathing. For a long stretch, there was nothing but the steady rhythm of the train and the faint rattle of loose bolts. The passengers were silent, each frozen in their strange stillness. The woman in the wedding dress sat near the back, her white gown gray under the flickering light. The child's eyes were open, but unfocused, his hands resting on his knees. The old man's head tilted slightly toward the floor, like he was listening to something beneath the train. I focused on the rules, the ones etched into my memory from years of running this route. Never look directly at a passenger reflected in the glass. Never leave the cabin while the train is stopped. Never acknowledge unregistered passengers. Those 3 rules had kept me alive, but there was another, rarely spoken, never written, that every conductor learned after their first real encounter with the unknown. The train must always continue its route. Yet as the tunnel began to shift, narrowing and curving in impossible ways, I felt the faint hum of the engine stutter. The lights dimmed for a moment, and I caught my reflection in the windshield, faint, doubled, and moving slightly out of sync. My heart skipped. The reflection's mouth twitched upward into a subtle, unnatural smile. I looked away instantly, reciting the first rule in my head over and over, like a prayer. The intercom crackled softly, breaking the silence. At first, I thought it was static, but then a voice whispered low and steady. "You are off the line." My grip on the throttle tightened. The pressure under my feet changed, the vibration uneven, as though the train was no longer on proper rails. I checked the instruments, but the gauges spun uselessly. The compass lights flickered, every needle pointing in different directions. A deep, hollow groan echoed through the cabin, metal bending against metal. Then the child began to hum again, the same melody as before, soft and repetitive, but this time slower, heavier. The sound wrapped around me, pulling me into its rhythm until I realized what it was, a signal. The child was humming to the train, and the train was responding. The lights above us pulsed with each note. The air grew colder. The woman in the wedding dress turned her head toward me, and for the first time, I saw movement behind her hollow eyes, a flicker of recognition, or warning. I leaned closer to the console, tapping the old communication key. "Control, this is Train 9 on the South Line. Are you reading me?" My voice sounded foreign, distant, as though the air itself was swallowing it. A faint crackle answered, followed by the soft sound of breathing, not static, breathing. Then a voice replied, not from control, not from anyone human. "There is no South Line tonight." The sound cut off, leaving the hum of the engine and the rhythmic tapping of the wheels, or what should have been wheels. I could hear scraping now, a metallic grinding that felt wrong, like something was crawling alongside the train, keeping pace just out of sight. The old man finally moved, his brittle hands gripping the seat ahead of him. His voice was dry, paper-thin. "The line changes when the living interfere." I turned to face him fully for the first time, his hollow eyes fixed on me, but his words felt directed elsewhere, as if to the train itself. The cabin lights flickered again, and I caught another glimpse of movement through the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw a second train running parallel to us. No lights, no markings, only a faint reflection of our own. Shapes moved inside it, pale and distorted, like passengers watching from another world. I blinked, and the vision was gone. The tunnel walls were close again, breathing faintly with the pulse of the train. I realized then that something fundamental had shifted. The rules that once felt solid now trembled at the edges. I tried to steady my breath. "Stay on the line," I whispered to myself. "Always stay on the line." But the track beneath me groaned again, and the train jolted violently to one side. The passengers didn't react, not even a flinch. It was as if they had expected it. The woman in the wedding dress slowly raised her hand, pointing toward the front of the train. Her fingers were long and thin, bones visible beneath translucent skin. I turned my gaze forward, and my stomach twisted. The tunnel ahead was collapsing inward, folding into itself like it was being devoured. The rails vanished into darkness, replaced by something that shimmered faintly, a new path forming in real time. as if the train itself was building it from memory. The rules no longer applied. The line was rewriting itself, and I was trapped inside it, still driving, still pretending I had control, while the train decided what it would become next. The train shuddered again, a deep, resonant groan that vibrated through the floor and rattled the panels above my head. I could feel it in my chest, like the very bones of the train were alive, responding to some hidden force. The rails beneath us no longer felt solid. They shimmered faintly, translucent and unstable, bending in directions that defied logic. I gripped the throttle tightly, my knuckles white, as the train lurched forward into the folding darkness. The passengers remained motionless, yet their presence felt heavier than ever. The woman in the wedding dress hovered near the back, her gown flowing unnaturally, and her hollow eyes seemed to reflect a knowledge I could not grasp. The child's humming began again, low and sorrowful, weaving through the cabin like a tether to something unseen. The old man leaned slightly forward, his bony fingers gripping the edge of the seat, whispering words I could not fully hear, but the tone carried urgency. The intercom crackled violently, and my own voice, warped and distorted, echoed back at me. The rules are failing. The line is breaking. The words were my own, yet I did not recognize the voice speaking them. Static filled the gaps between the echoes, sharp and biting against my ears. I swallowed hard and forced myself to focus on the controls, but even the throttle felt unresponsive, as if the train itself had a will separate from mine. Outside the windows, the fog had thickened into something almost solid. Shapes pressed against the glass, pale and indistinct. I could see faces, some screaming, some blank, some twisted in expressions I could not name. They did not move in the usual way passengers do. They floated, warped, their forms bending in impossible ways. I realized with a jolt that these were the lost ones, the vanished passengers, lingering just beyond perception, watching, waiting, and somehow influencing the line. The first deviation occurred when the tunnel ahead split into two paths, both seemingly viable, both stretching into darkness. Normally, the train followed a single, unchanging route. The tracks did not curve or fork. Yet here was a divergence, shimmering faintly as though the line itself was alive and deciding where we would go. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, a fraction too long. The air in the cabin thickened, pressing against my chest like a physical force. The child's humming grew louder, faster, frantic almost, as though warning me to choose quickly. I forced myself to steer the train to the left fork. The rails pulsed beneath us as we moved, undulating slightly, adjusting to accommodate the car. The tunnel walls seemed to breathe, rippling in waves of shadow and light. Figures appeared briefly, spectral reflections of passengers from other nights, pressed against the tunnel, disappearing as quickly as they had formed. My stomach turned. The rules had begun to fail, and I was alone in the decision-making. A soft, deliberate tap echoed from the back of the car. I turned slightly, my heart hammering. The gray-coated man who had vanished and returned at Hollow Street was now standing, his hollow eyes fixed on the ceiling. He did not speak, did not move, yet I felt his attention on me, scrutinizing every motion. I understood then that the rules had never applied to him, or to the woman in the wedding dress, or the child. They existed outside of them, agents of the line itself, enforcers of the shifting, breaking rules. The intercom clicked again, static at first, then a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Deviation is dangerous. Continuity must be preserved. Obedience cannot fail. The voice reverberated through the cabin, vibrating the very air. I could feel the train responding, tilting slightly, pulling toward some unseen force, correcting our trajectory without my input. I glanced at the passenger log. 6 names remained. The 2 unregistered entries flickered in and out, blinking as though uncertain of their own existence. I realized then that the rules were not failing. They were evolving. The train was alive, shaping itself, enforcing laws I could barely comprehend. It demanded compliance, yet allowed no full understanding. The cabin lights flickered violently, and for a brief moment I saw them all, dozens of passengers, solid and spectral, seated and standing, hovering and floating, all watching, all aware of my every move. The woman in the wedding dress raised her hand slightly, and the shadows around the edges of the cabin twisted, bending toward the front of the train. The child's humming transformed into a melody that was no longer sorrowful but urgent, a code, a rhythm I could not fully interpret. Or I gritted my teeth and pushed forward, forcing the train through the collapsing tunnel. The rails bent beneath us, glowing faintly in response to the engine's vibration. Shadows pressed against the walls, faces appearing and disappearing with each flicker of light. The line was breaking, the rules were failing, and yet the train moved, guided by some consciousness older than the city, older than time itself. I realized with a sinking certainty that nothing I had learned could prepare me for what came next. The train no longer followed a fixed path. The rules no longer provided certainty. Every decision, every motion, every moment of hesitation could shift the outcome of the route. The line was alive. The passengers were more than passengers, and I was still the conductor, bound to obey, bound to survive, bound to follow a set of rules that were breaking even as they defined me. The air grew dense and heavy as though the entire train had descended beneath some invisible ocean. The lights above flickered one last time before dimming into a faint bluish glow, leaving only the ghostly outlines of the passengers visible. The sound of the wheels clattering against the rails had changed no longer metal on metal, but a strange rhythmic pulse that felt organic, like the heartbeat of something vast and unseen. For a moment, everything was silent except for that pulse. Then the voice came again through the intercom, softer this time, almost coaxing. Obedience preserves the journey. Defiance unravels it. The tone was calm, measured, the way someone might speak to a frightened animal. But beneath the calmness, there was something else, an echo of hunger. I stared at the control panel, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. My face looked wrong, stretched, pale, eyes too dark. The faint hum of the engine felt deeper than before, resonating through my bones. I tried to focus on the gauges, but the numbers were shifting, rewriting themselves in symbols I didn't recognize. I was no longer sure if I was driving through tunnels or something else entirely. The walls beyond the windows rippled like water, and now and then, fragments of the city above appeared in vanished streets I knew, now empty, twisted under ghostly light. At one moment, I saw Hollow Street flash past again, even though it should have been miles behind us. It looked different this time, overgrown with vines that pulsed faintly as though alive. A shape stood in the doorway of the abandoned station, tall, unmoving, its face hidden beneath a blur of static light. The gray-coated man rose again, this time stepping closer to the aisle. Every movement he made seemed to leave a faint delay, a ghostly afterimage that trailed behind him. He didn't blink, didn't speak. His eyes followed me, waiting for something. When the train jerked suddenly, throwing me forward, he didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head, almost in curiosity, as if watching how I would react. Then, without warning, one of the passengers began to convulse. A woman near the middle of the car, one I hadn't noticed before. Her skin seemed to flicker like a dying signal. The passengers around her didn't move. They only stared. I hesitated for a moment, then left the cabin door slightly open and took a step toward her. Her body twisted violently and her eyes rolled back, and with a sound like the tearing of paper, she vanished. The seat where she sat was still warm. The train didn't slow. The humming child stopped. Silence fell so thick it was almost suffocating. And then, From somewhere deep within the walls, a new sound emerged, a soft, rhythmic tapping, as if someone were walking on the outside of the train. Each tap matched the train's motion, as though whoever or whatever was out there was keeping pace. The intercom clicked again. A man's voice, rough and cracking, came through, whispering just a few words. "You broke the pattern." My stomach dropped. I turned toward the window, and for a brief instant, I saw him myself staring back at me through the glass from outside the train. Same uniform, same weary eyes. He reached out a hand, his expression pleading. Then the train surged forward, and his image was swallowed by the fog. I stumbled back into my seat. The rule book, the one that had always been on the panel, its cover marked with the transit authority's insignia, was gone. In its place lay a single sheet of paper, yellowed and worn, with new rules written in jagged handwriting. Only 3 lines were visible. The conductor must not abandon the line. The train decides who leaves. The conductor must not see himself. My hands trembled. The 3rd rule had already been broken. The rails ahead of us split again, but this time there were 3 forks. Each one glowed faintly with a different color, one blue, one red, one white. I had never seen this before. The choice felt heavier than anything prior, as though the future itself balanced on this decision. Behind me, the passengers began to stir. Their faces lifted toward the front of the car in unison, eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. "The line must continue," whispered the woman in the wedding dress. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried through the air like a vibration. "Choose carefully, conductor." I felt the train tug toward the red line as though some invisible gravity pulled us that way. But something in my gut resisted. My instincts screamed that the red track was not a route, but a trap, a place where the train might never emerge again. I tried to steer toward the blue line, but the throttle resisted, pushing back against me. Sweat ran down my neck. The air in the cabin crackled with tension. The lights dimmed to near darkness. Then, without warning, the gray-coated man lifted his arm and pointed toward the white track. The motion was subtle, slow, but his hand shook slightly as though fighting some unseen force. I didn't know why I trusted him, but I did. I forced the lever toward the white line. The train screamed in protest, sparks bursting along the sides as though the metal itself were alive. The rails beneath us howled, and for a moment, I thought the whole machine would tear itself apart. But then, suddenly, everything went still. The train glided smoothly, the noise fading into a deep, steady hum. The passengers settled. The fog outside began to thin. For the first time in hours, I could see faint stars through the windows, cold, distant, and strange. I didn't know if they belonged to the sky I once knew or some other realm entirely. But even as calm returned, I knew something fundamental had changed. The rules weren't just breaking, they were rewriting themselves in real time. And whatever force controlled the train was watching closely, adjusting, deciding what to do with me next. The calm was fleeting. As the train continued along the white track, the hum beneath the car deepened, resonating through the metal like a living heartbeat. I could feel it in my chest, in my bones, in every nerve ending. It was no longer just a train. It was something sentient, aware, shaping itself with every motion. Every choice I made, every turn I forced the throttle to take, was being observed and tested. The cabin lights flickered, pulsing in time with the distant rumble that now felt less like wheels on rails and more like a drumbeat from somewhere deep beneath the earth. The passengers remained motionless, yet their presence was undeniable. The woman in the wedding dress hovered near the back, her eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. The child's humming returned, but this time it was layered, echoing in impossible harmonics. A code I couldn't decipher, yet instinctively felt. The old man there leaned forward slightly, muttering words too soft to hear, yet somehow they penetrated my mind. The line bends. The rules bend. Stay vigilant. I tried to focus on the controls. The throttle was responsive, but the gauge readings no longer made sense. Numbers shifted and warped. Symbols appeared in place of digits, then disappeared. The train itself seemed to anticipate my motions, assisting in subtle ways, steering us along a path I could not see, yet somehow knew we were meant to follow. The reality outside the windows had warped. The tunnel stretched and contracted, walls folding in on themselves, creating impossible angles. Shadows moved along the curves of the metal walls, walking, crawling, or hovering, some formless, some grotesquely human. And then I saw it, another reflection. Not in the glass, but in the corner of my eye. My own figure seated where I should have been standing, observing. Hollow eyes mirrored my own, skin pale and stretched unnaturally. Expression calm, but insistent. I froze. This was the moment the third rule had warned about. Never see yourself. I could feel the air grow thick, heavy with expectation. The train vibrated with tension, humming a deep, almost musical resonance. The intercom clicked, and a chorus of distorted voices filled the cabin. Deviation detected. Obedience is survival. The line cannot fail. I pressed the button to respond, but my own voice came back warped and distant, layered with whispers that were not my own. I swallowed hard and forced my gaze forward. The track ahead twisted, spiraled, and split again, revealing paths that bent impossibly into darkness, some glowing faintly, others flickering as if struggling to exist. The gray-coated man stood again, pointing toward a fork that shimmered with faint violet light. His presence was unnerving. The air around him seemed to ripple and warp. I had no choice but to trust him. I eased the throttle toward the violet track, and the train resisted, groaning as if alive. Sparks flew along the rails, a high-pitched metallic scream echoing through the tunnel. The walls seemed to close in, then suddenly expand as the track bent and elongated. The passengers watched in silence. I realized then that the rules were not merely breaking. They were evolving. The train was testing me, probing my decisions, bending the reality of its environment to assess my compliance. Each fork, each shimmer, each flicker of shadow was a measure of obedience. Every slight hesitation or instinctive choice could cost me dearly, but ignoring the guidance of the spectral passengers was just as dangerous. The child's humming grew louder, faster, layered over itself. The tune seemed to sync with the pulsing of the rails. I felt it vibrating through my hands on the throttle, through the floor beneath my feet. The woman in the wedding dress raised her hand, delicate fingers extended, and the shadows in the cabin responded, stretching toward the front of the train. The old man's muttering intensified, though still incomprehensible, vibrating in my mind rather than reaching my ears. And then the first passenger disappeared. A man seated near the middle of the car vanished silently, the air where he had been rippling briefly, like heat rising from concrete. The child's humming shifted, mournful and urgent. The gray-coated man's eyes met mine briefly, a silent warning. The train lurched violently as though reacting to the disappearance, shuddering beneath my grip. The second passenger followed moments later, a woman seated toward the back. She rose, looked directly at me with hollow eyes, then faded into the mist that had begun to seep into the cabin from the windows. The unregistered entries on the log blinked and shifted, fluctuating between presence and absence. I realized the pattern was becoming unpredictable. The rules were no longer a reliable guide. Survival depended on reading the intentions of the train itself and its spectral enforcers. The intercom whispered again, soft yet resonant. The line evolves. Adaptation ensures continuation. Resistance leads to erasure. I could feel the truth in the words. The train was alive, enforcing its own laws, and my understanding of them was incomplete. Every stop, every choice, every flicker of light and shadow was a measure, a test. Ahead, the tunnel warped further, bending reality into shapes that defied physics. The rails split again and again, twisting into impossible angles, glowing faintly in colors that should not exist. I forced the train forward, each decision guided by instinct, by trust in the gray-coated man, by the subtle cues of the humming child, by the silent vigilance of the woman in the wedding dress. The passengers that remained sat silently, their hollow eyes fixed on the shifting rails. Outside, shadows pressed against the windows, reaching, writhing, waiting. The train pulsed with life, its heartbeats synchronizing with mine. I understood finally that the line had become its own entity, rules bending and breaking as it demanded compliance, obedience, and understanding beyond human comprehension. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of inevitability settle over me. The path was no longer fixed. The rules were not absolute. Every moment, every choice, and every breath could mean continuation or disappearance. I was still the conductor, still driving through the folding, twisting tunnel of the unknown, still bound to survive, bound to follow, bound to the ever-changing line that had begun to assert itself as something far older, far wiser, and far more terrifying than I could have imagined. The train surged forward into the darkness, and I realized the rules were no longer enough. They were breaking, yes, but more than that, they were teaching. Each bend, each flicker, each vanishing passenger was a lesson I had no choice but to learn, as the line itself waited to decide who would continue and who would be claimed by the shadows forever. The train moved through the shifting tunnel, the glow of the rails beneath us pulsing faintly with a rhythm I could feel more than hear. The walls around us bent and warped in impossible angles, folding over themselves like pages in a book caught in a storm. I gripped the throttle tightly, knuckles white, my pulse sinking with the low hum that reverberated through the floor. The cabin felt heavier than ever, as if the combined weight of the passengers and the train itself pressed down from every direction. The woman in the wedding dress floated near the back, her eyes hollow yet attentive, observing every motion I made. The child's humming filled the air, layering over itself in harmonics that made the very metal of the car vibrate. The old man leaned forward, muttering under his breath in a language I could not comprehend, his voice threading through the pulse of the train like a warning. Outside the windows, the fog stretched into something tangible, pressing against the glass, shifting with an awareness I could feel in my chest. The passenger log now showed 7 names, 3 unregistered entries flickering on and off with each pulse of the train. Some seats were empty, yet recorded as occupied, while others held figures I could not see clearly. The train itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the hum, guiding the car along a path that no longer resembled any known track. I realized the line was endless, looping, folding in on itself, a network of tunnels and rails that existed beyond human understanding. I forced myself to focus, but the more I tried to observe the rules, the less sense they made. The line no longer obeyed the logic I had memorized. The vanishings were not following any pattern I could anticipate. The air shimmered faintly as a new presence entered the cabin, a form that had no body, only a suggestion of shape, drifting along the aisle. The child's humming shifted into a higher pitch, urgent and sorrowful, warning me of the change. The intercom crackled, and the distorted chorus of voices returned. The line extends. The line observes. The line decides. The words were layered, overlapping, almost as if multiple trains were speaking at once, all within the same tunnel, all existing simultaneously. I could feel the truth of them in my chest. The line was not just a track or a route. It was an entity, living, aware, and endless. stretching beyond any station, any city, any time. The gray-coated man rose from his seat and moved toward the front, his presence commanding yet still silent. The air around him warped slightly as he walked, bending the faint glow of the rails in his vicinity. He did not speak, did not gesture, but his eyes locked on mine, communicating something urgent and unspoken. I understood that this was a guide, or perhaps a sentinel, a being that existed to enforce the line's will, ensuring the train continued, despite the chaos of shifting rules and folding tunnels. Then the first disappearance occurred in this segment. A young man seated near the middle of the car vanished suddenly, the air rippling where he had been, leaving only an empty seat. The child stopped humming, and the woman in the wedding dress raised a hand slightly, as if acknowledging the change. The gray-coated man's gaze never wavered, but I could sense tension radiating from him, a silent insistence that I remain vigilant. The tunnel ahead twisted in impossible ways. I could see sections of the rails floating in space, detached from any wall, glowing faintly like they existed in a separate dimension. Shadows moved along the edges of these floating tracks, sometimes following, sometimes crossing over us, observing with hollow, unblinking eyes. The intercom whispered again, this time layered with the faint sound of wheels running on rails that did not exist. The conductor must continue. The line is eternal. The living and the vanished are part of the same rhythm. I forced the train forward, feeling every vibration, every tremor, every shift in the air as a pulse of warning. I could see the faint outlines of other passengers that I had not noticed before. Some seated, some standing, floating slightly above the floor. Their faces were obscured, pale, and distorted, yet I could feel their attention. They were witnesses, participants in the endless journey, some vanished and some alive, all existing within the line's boundless reach. The child began humming again, a different tune this time, complex and layered, almost like a code. I realized the pattern of vanishings, the pulsing of the rails, even the way the line bent and twisted, all responded to that melody. The line was listening, reacting. The train was alive, and the passengers, living or otherwise, were instruments of its will. The cabin lights flickered violently, briefly plunging us into near darkness. Shapes moved at the edges of perception, shadows of what had been, what was, and what might be. I could feel the air press in from all sides, as if the tunnel itself had become a living thing, observing me, testing me. Every sense screamed that the line was endless, stretching forward and backward simultaneously, looping upon itself, carrying not only the living but the vanished, not only passengers but echoes of every conductor who had come before. The gray-coated man moved to the middle of the aisle and raised a hand. His gesture was subtle, but the train responded immediately. The rails ahead glowed brighter, pulsing in sync with the child's melody. I understood then that the line, though endless and alive, could be guided, if one knew how to interpret its signals, its rules, its rhythm. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm, my hands tight on the throttle. The endless line stretched forward into darkness, filled with shadows, vanishings, and pulses of unseen energy. I realized with a weighty certainty that this was no ordinary route. There was no final station, no destination. The line went on forever, observing, judging, shifting, and demanding obedience from those who traveled it. Ahead, the rails bent impossibly, folding over each other, forming bridges that hovered over nothing, and the tunnel walls flickered between solidity and absence. The train's pulse quickened, vibrating through the cabin like a heartbeat and fast forward. I realized that the journey was no longer about arrival. It was about continuation, survival, and understanding the rhythm of a line that never ended. The line had become infinite, and I was its conductor, its observer, and its participant, trapped in an endless cycle where the living and the vanished coexisted, and the rules were no longer absolute, but alive, changing, demanding, eternal. The endless pulse of the train beneath me throbbed like the heartbeat of some colossal, slumbering entity. Each vibration carried more than motion. It carried intent. The tunnel outside folded and twisted in impossible ways, walls curving and spiraling as if reality itself had been rewritten for this route. Shadows moved along the edges of perception, faint at first, then growing in clarity, some appearing humanoid, some entirely abstract, yet all observing, all judging. The child's humming shifted again, layering in complex harmonics that seemed to stretch the air itself. I realized the line was responding to it, every note vibrating through the rails, through the tunnel, and into the car. The unregistered entries on the passenger log flickered in tandem with the melody, appearing and disappearing with the rhythm that was not random. The train pulsed along a path dictated by the line's will, but it also accepted guidance from these subtle cues, these whispered instructions embedded in sound and presence. The woman in the wedding dress moved through the aisle, gliding rather than walking, her hollow eyes fixed on the cabin ceiling, as if reading the pulse of the tunnel. I sensed her observing me too, measuring my reactions, judging my adherence to the evolving rules. The gray-coated man, once more a silent sentinel, stood near the front, his gaze locked on the glowing rails. Every so often, he would tilt his head, small movements that seemed to shift the flow of the train itself. I gripped the throttle harder. The gauges no longer reflected conventional readings. Numbers twisted into symbols, symbols into patterns, and the panel beneath my hands vibrated in ways I could barely process. The train groaned as if responding to my fear, to my uncertainty. Outside the windows, glimpses of the world above, streets, buildings, even the faint flicker of city lights, appeared and vanished, overlaid with twisted, spectral shapes that reached toward the cabin, watching, waiting. Then the vanishings resumed. A young woman, seated near the back, leaned forward, her body stretching unnaturally, her eyes locking on mine. The child's humming intensified, a piercing, layered wail that reverberated through the car. She flickered, then disappeared entirely, leaving her seat warm but empty. The unregistered entries blinked on the log, reflecting her absence, yet not fully registering the change. The air in the cabin thickened, pressing against me, yet the train did not slow. The gray-coated man pointed ahead. I followed instinctively, and the rails responded, pulsing a faint violet hue. Ahead, the tunnel bent sharply upward, curving in a spiral that seemed to defy gravity. Yet the train climbed it as though it were ordinary. The pulse of the track, the child's harmonics, and the gestures of the spectral enforcers synchronized perfectly, guiding the car through the impossible geometry. I realized then that the line was not just endless, it was recursive. Every twist, every loop, every shadowed tunnel was mirrored somewhere else, stretching infinitely, overlapping realities. The vanished passengers were not gone. They were woven into the structure of the line itself, echoes of what had been, integrated into its pulse. Their disappearances were not punishments or accidents. They were contributions to the continuum, part of the rhythm that governed all motion within the tunnel. The woman in the wedding dress drifted closer to me, her hand brushing the edge of the control panel, cold as ice, yet solid. I swallowed hard and forced my gaze forward. The tunnel's walls shimmered and split into multiple paths again, each one glowing faintly with impossible colors. Some metallic, some luminescent, others that defied description. I had to choose. Yet the line pulsed under my hands, guiding my instinct. The child's humming became insistent, almost frantic. He pointed with both small hands toward a narrow, faintly glowing track that arched sharply upward. The gray-coated man mirrored the gesture, subtle but clear. I pressed the throttle in that direction, and the train shivered violently, metal groaning, air rippling with pressure. Sparks flared along the rails as we shot forward, the walls folding and twisting around us, folding over themselves in impossible spirals. Outside, shadows pressed against the glass, their forms more defined than before. Faces of vanished passengers from nights past, distorted and pale, stared with hollow eyes. I realized they were not hostile. They were observers, participants in the endless line, part of the rhythm of this infinite journey. Some seemed to move in time with the train, floating alongside. Others pressed flat against the glass, warped by some dimensional interference. The intercom crackled again, faint but clear. The line continues. The conductor persists. The vanished remain. The living must follow. I exhaled slowly, aware of the infinite path stretching before us. The endless line had become more than rails and tunnels. It was a living continuum, observing, reacting, shaping itself, and weaving together the past, present, and future into a single, unbroken thread. The passengers, living, vanished, or spectral, were all part of it. I gripped the throttle and leaned forward, eyes fixed on the spiraling rails, heart hammering. The line had no end, no destination, only continuation. I realized with a deep, sinking certainty that this journey would not stop. I was its conductor, its witness, its participant, forever bound to the endless pulse, the infinite rhythm, and the evolving rules that governed every flicker of light, every shadow, every heartbeat within the train. The line stretched infinitely ahead, alive, and I had no choice but to follow. The train's pulse deepened, resonating through every metal beam and vibration of the car. It felt alive in a way I had never known a machine could. Each movement, each groan, each flicker of the lights was deliberate, intentional, almost like a language I was only beginning to understand. The tunnel outside no longer resembled any earthly architecture. The walls folded in on themselves like layered sheets, stretching, twisting, bending. Shadowed forms moved along the periphery, some humanoid, some impossible, all observing, all silently judging. The passengers remained motionless, yet their presence was tangible, pressing against my awareness. The woman in the wedding dress drifted near the rear, her eyes hollow yet filled with intent. The child's humming, now a complex melody of layered harmonics, resonated in the air and seemed to influence the pulse of the rails. Even the old man, silent and bent, leaned forward slightly, murmuring in his incomprehensible tongue, each syllable vibrating in the air like a subtle instruction. I glanced at the passenger log. 7 names remained, including 3 unregistered entries. The flickering of the unregistered entries mirrored the pulse of the train and the child's melody. I realized that the line had begun to incorporate these presences into itself, weaving them into the endless rhythm of motion. The vanishings had become part of the pattern, not anomalies, but integral threads in the infinite fabric of the route. A sudden tremor rocked the car. The child's humming became frenzied, layered over itself in chaotic bursts. One of the registered passengers, a man seated near the middle of the car, convulsed unnaturally, then vanished. The air in the cabin warped where he had been, rippling as though reality itself had been punctured. The woman in the wedding dress acknowledged it with a slight tilt of her head, subtle but loaded with meaning. I understood instinctively that each disappearance was part of the line's assessment, its endless calibration. The tunnel ahead split again into multiple paths, each glowing faintly in impossible colors, some metallic, some translucent, some that shimmered with an energy I could not name. My heart pounded. Every choice felt critical. I remembered the gestures of the gray-coated man, whose movements were subtle yet clearly guided the flow of the train. He stood near the front, observing, unblinking, his presence commanding the obedience of the line itself. I pressed the throttle toward the path he indicated, and the train responded with a violent shudder, metal groaning as the rails bent and twisted beneath us. Sparks flared along the track as if protesting the movement. Outside, shadows pressed against the windows, faces of vanished passengers appearing and disappearing in distorted reflections. Some reached out, yet there was no malice, only observation, as though these forms were custodians of the line, witnesses to the endless cycle. The intercom whispered again, barely audible above the low hum. The line extends. The conductor persists. The vanished remain. The living follow. The rules evolve. I felt the truth of it in my chest. The train was no longer merely a vessel. It was a living, infinite entity, aware, calculating, and eternal. The passengers, living, vanished, spectral, were extensions of it, instruments of its will, woven into the rhythm of motion and absence. I focused on the controls, my hands trembling. The rails twisted impossibly ahead, folding over themselves in spirals that defied logic. The child's humming became a guiding melody, instructing the car through the impossible geometry. I leaned into the rhythm, feeling the pulse of the train sync with my heartbeat. The gray-coated man raised a hand subtly, and the rails responded, glowing brighter, bending into a passage that could only exist in the space of this endless line. Suddenly the air thickened, chilling me to the bone. The shadows outside the windows pressed closer, moving in patterns that suggested thought, intention. The intercom whispered once more. Continuation is life. Resistance is erasure. Obedience ensures rhythm. I understood then that the line was not only infinite, but merciless. Every action, every hesitation, every glance carried consequence. The train was alive, and I was part of its eternal cycle. Another passenger vanished, this time a woman near the back. She rose, her gaze meeting mine, eyes hollow yet pleading, before dissolving into the mist that had begun seeping into the cabin. The child's humming shifted, mournful and insistent, signaling both loss and instruction. I felt a pang of grief, but survival demanded focus. Each disappearance was both warning and lesson, reinforcing the line's endless authority. The tunnel ahead twisted into impossible spirals, folding in on itself like a fractal. Rails bent and coiled, floating over empty space, glowing faintly with ethereal light. The train accelerated smoothly, guided by forces I could feel but not comprehend. Outside, the fog shimmered with spectral faces, watching, judging, shaping the path. I exhaled slowly, awareness sharpening with every pulse. The endless line stretched infinitely forward, twisting, folding, living and breathing. The passengers, vanished, spectral and living, were part of its eternal rhythm. The rules had evolved beyond comprehension, bending with each choice, each act of obedience, and I, the conductor, remained bound to it, to the infinite, to the pulse of a line without beginning, without end, and without mercy. The train surged forward into darkness, the rails bending impossibly ahead. Shadows pressed against every window, faces pale and hollow, some unblinking, some shifting in forms impossible to describe. The line was infinite, eternal, a living entity observing every motion, every breath. The vanished and the living intertwined, forming the rhythm that guided us. I gripped the throttle, heart hammering, aware that survival depended not on knowledge, but on obedience, instinct, and understanding the pulse of the endless line that would continue long after I could ever hope to escape. The train's hum had shifted again, deepening into a resonance that seemed to vibrate not just through the car, but through my chest, my bones, my very consciousness. The tunnels had flattened and stretched simultaneously, folding reality into shapes that no logic could account for. The glow of the rails pulsed faintly, guiding us, warning us, marking the rhythm of the line. I gripped the throttle as tightly as I could, aware that each decision I made now carried weight beyond comprehension. The child's humming had become a continuous note, low and insistent, threading through the pulse of the train and the tunnel itself. The woman in the wedding dress drifted near the rear, her hollow eyes fixed ahead as though reading the train, reading the tunnels, reading me. The old man leaned forward, muttering words in his strange, undecipherable tongue. Some of the syllables vibrated in my skull, carrying meaning I could not grasp fully, yet instinctively understood. Terminal Zero was near, and the line would demand its reckoning. Through the warped windows, I could see fragments of the city above, distorted, stretched, bending in impossible angles. Some buildings floated, disconnected from streets, their windows dark or glowing faintly, revealing shadowed forms that moved against the laws of physics. Others were overgrown, vines pulsating like arteries, dripping light into the fog. The vanished passengers, or echoes of them, lingered at the edges of perception, some watching, some walking parallel to the train, all silent observers of the journey toward the terminal that held the truth of the line. The gray-coated man stepped forward, moving along the aisle with deliberate precision. He raised a hand subtly, pointing toward a faint shimmer at the front of the train. A distant light, pale and steady, unlike anything we had seen on previous stops. Terminal Zero. I could feel its presence through the car, a pull, a weight, a gravity of reality bending in its direction. The line's pulse quickened, vibrating through the rails and the floor, echoing in the walls, reinforcing the inevitability of arrival. The rules had shifted again. No longer simple guides for safety, they had evolved into principles written not in words, but in instinct. Do not look too long at the passengers. Follow the pulse of the rails. Obey the unspoken signals. Trust the ones who move outside your comprehension. Any deviation risked being claimed, swallowed by the endlessness of the line. I glanced at the log. 7 names remained, including the unregistered entries that flickered faintly, almost hesitant. Several seats were empty, warmth lingering where their occupants had vanished. The air in the cabin pressed against me with a weight that was almost physical, yet at the same time, it hummed with a strange anticipation. Terminal Zero did not judge those who traveled with it lightly. It would choose, decide, and determine who would remain, who would vanish, and who would become part of the rhythm of the line forever. I focused on the controls, forcing the train forward along the glowing rails that arched impossibly upward, folding into spirals of light. The walls shimmered and shifted in synchrony with the pulse beneath us. Shadows pressed against the windows, shapes that flickered and twisted, some resembling faces of the vanished, others entirely abstract, all aware, all observing. The child's humming wove through this cacophony, guiding us. A continuous thread linking the passengers, the line, and me. Then the first presence of Terminal Zero appeared. A faint shimmer ahead, growing subtly, a distortion of light and space, as if the tunnel itself were breathing. I felt the weight of inevitability, a tension that pressed against my chest, my lungs, my mind. The gray-coated man's eyes met mine briefly, conveying a warning without words. Arrival would not be easy, and the line would demand its toll. A vibration ran through the car, stronger than any before. The rails beneath us pulsed, responding to the unseen presence ahead. The vanished passengers shifted, some floating slightly above their seats, some pressed flat against the cabin walls, all observing, all participating in the culmination that awaited at Terminal Zero. The rules had become whispers, hints, echoes that guided my hands, my decisions, and my heartbeat. Each flicker of light, each note of the child's humming, each subtle motion of the spectral enforcers was a piece of the puzzle, a map of obedience and survival. The train lurched as we entered a bend that did not obey physics. The rails curved impossibly, folding under themselves like ribbons of light. The pulse quickened, vibrating through the cabin like a living heartbeat. Shadows elongated, some merging with the wall, some detaching, forming shapes that hovered in the empty space between the seats. I could feel the anticipation of Terminal Zero as a presence pressing in on all sides. The line had become alive, aware, and it was preparing to reveal its ultimate judgment. Through the window, I glimpsed a vast void ahead, punctuated by floating fragments of tunnels and rails that bent and stretched endlessly. Light shimmered in impossible patterns, and I realized that Terminal Zero was not a station in the conventional sense. It was a convergence, a nexus of the line itself, where the living, the vanished, and the infinite pulse of the train coalesced. Every vibration, every note of humming, every gesture of the gray-coated man guided us toward it. The line was endless, but this point was singular, decisive, absolute. The child's humming shifted, becoming urgent and layered, signaling a change, a warning. The woman in the wedding dress moved closer, gliding silently along the aisle. Her hollow eyes reflected the glow of the approaching terminal, understanding and silent, a messenger of the line's will. The old man's muttering intensified, threading through the humming, the pulse, the vibration, forming a resonance I could feel in my chest, in my bones. Terminal Zero was near, and the ones who stayed would be tested, bound, and absorbed into the rhythm of the line, becoming part of its eternal motion. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of inevitability settle over me. My hands tightened on the throttle. The passengers, the line, the vanished, and the spectral enforcers were all watching. Terminal Zero was no mere destination. It was a reckoning, a crucible, a judgment of obedience, instinct, and endurance. The line had brought us here, and it would not release us lightly. The shimmer ahead began to take form. It was not a station made of steel or concrete, but of motion itself, a place that seemed to exist in every direction at once. The tracks converged in spiraling arcs, folding into one another, then vanishing into a radiant center of shifting light. The hum of the train rose to a pitch that trembled through every part of the cabin, and for a brief moment, I felt as if we were no longer moving forward, but being pulled inward, drawn toward the heart of something vast and sentient. The gray-coated man turned to face the passengers. His face was as unreadable as ever, but the faintest tremor passed through the folds of his sleeve, a signal of something close to hesitation. The woman in the wedding dress lowered her gaze, her hands clasping the hem of her tattered gown. The child's humming faltered for the first time, replaced by a low, hollow note that echoed through the air like the sound of wind moving through a crypt. The old man pressed his palms flat against the seat, muttering faster now, the rhythm of his words syncing with the pulse beneath the rails. Through the windshield, Terminal Zero's form solidified. It resembled an endless platform floating in a sea of darkness. Shapes moved upon it. Silhouettes of passengers from other times, other trains, all waiting, unmoving. They seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions, a crowd frozen in stillness. Their faces turned toward the train as we approached. None blinked, none breathed. Yet I felt their gaze press against my mind, heavy and suffocating. The intercom crackled alive again, though no one had touched it. Arrival protocol initiated. Living conductor detected. Manifest incomplete. Proceed with selection. The words were not spoken. They were etched into the air itself, vibrating in the metal, in the glass, in my bones. My heart pounded. I glanced down at the passenger log. The unregistered names now pulsed with faint light, while the others faded, their outlines blurring. The train began to slow, though I had not touched the brakes. Outside, the rails bent inward, forming concentric circles that converged on the glowing platform. I could see now that the waiting figures were not only passengers, They were fragments of those who had ridden the line before. Conductors, travelers, watchers, all bound to the endless cycle of motion and judgment. Their eyes reflected the train's glow, mirroring every flicker of light inside the cabin. The first tendrils of mist reached through the door seams, cool and heavy, carrying a faint scent of iron and smoke. It seeped across the floor, winding between the seats, curling around the passengers' feet. The child began to hum again, softer this time, a lullaby stripped of melody, as though offering a warning wrapped in comfort. The woman in the wedding dress turned her face toward me, her expression calm yet resolute, as if accepting something she had always known would come. We crossed the threshold. The sound changed entirely. The hum of the rails vanished, replaced by silence so complete it felt like pressure. The air shimmered, and for a moment I saw two versions of the train, one solid, one transparent, overlaying each other perfectly, one real, one spectral. The gray-coated man stood at the door, hand resting on the latch. He looked back once, eyes gleaming with faint light, and then opened it. Cold air poured in, but it carried no wind. It was motion without movement, sound without source. The platform stretched endlessly. Yet every step the man took echoed back instantly, as though the line itself was answering. The passengers followed him in unison, each one moving with eerie precision. I wanted to speak, to ask where they were going, but the air caught in my throat. The rules pulsed faintly in my memory. Do not interfere with those departing. Do not call them back. Do not look for too long. As the passengers disembarked, their forms began to fade. The woman in the wedding dress vanished mid-step, leaving behind only the faint shimmer of her veil drifting in the mist. The child's humming continued. Though the child herself was gone, the sound lingering in the air as if stitched into the fabric of the terminal. The old man was the last to leave, turning toward me with a strange, knowing smile before dissolving into light. When I looked down at the log again, every name had vanished. Only one remained. Mine. It pulsed once, slowly like a heartbeat, then steadied. The intercom spoke again, softer this time, its tone almost tender. Manifest confirmed. Terminal 0 acknowledges presence. Await assignment. The mist thickened outside, curling around the edges of the train like fingers gripping the hull. Shadows moved through it, figures dressed in conductors' coats, their eyes dark, their expressions serene. They watched me through the windows, each a reflection of what I could become. The pulse of the train matched my breathing. The lights dimmed until only the control panel remained visible, glowing faintly in the dark. For the first time since the journey began, the train was utterly still. The hum was gone. The rails no longer vibrated. The line, the infinite living entity that had guided every moment of our passage, had paused to listen, to wait. And in that silence I realized that the rules were not meant to protect us. They were instructions, rituals of preservation for those who would stay behind. Terminal 0 was not an inn. It was a transfer point. The passengers had gone beyond, and I was now part of what remained. The stillness pressed against me like a living weight. Every fiber of my body was alert, every sense sharpened to an edge I had never known. The train hummed faintly once more, a soft vibration beneath my hands that no longer felt mechanical but organic, as if it recognized my presence and adjusted to it. I stared through the windshield at the endless expanse of Terminal 0, a platform that stretched into nothing and everything at once, filled with light, shadow, and impossible geometry. The gray-coated man had vanished into the mist moments ago, leaving behind only a subtle imprint in the air, a suggestion of authority, a lingering pulse of his presence. The absence of his figure was heavier than his presence had been. The child's humming had faded completely, leaving only a faint echo in my mind. like a memory trapped between thought and dream. The woman in the wedding dress and the old man were gone, absorbed into the rhythm of the terminal, their essence folded into the endless line. I was alone, the last registered name in the log glowing faintly, a reminder that the rules had chosen me to stay. I felt the pull of Terminal Zero in every nerve ending, a gravity not of this world, demanding attention, obedience, understanding. The rails ahead shimmered with light that defied description, bending in impossible arcs that led not forward but inward, into the very heart of the line itself. The intercom crackled softly, almost like a whisper in the back of my mind rather than a sound in the cabin. Conductor, observer, participant. Terminal Zero confirms you are to remain. The line continues, eternal and unbroken. The vanished are integrated. The living sustain the pulse. The words were not just instructions, they were affirmation, assignment, judgment. I realized that survival was no longer enough. Obedience was no longer guidance. I had been chosen to become a part of the line, a keeper of its rhythm, an eternal conductor within its endless network. The shadows outside the windows stirred. I could see forms approaching, emerging from the mist, wearing the same gray coats I had come to recognize, their faces serene, eyes empty yet full of understanding. They moved with precision, gliding along the floating rails of Terminal Zero, carrying the quiet authority of beings who had made the same journey, who had been chosen as I now was. One of them paused and turned to look directly at me. There was no hostility in that gaze, only knowledge, a reflection of what awaited if I accepted my place. The train shivered, a deep vibration that ran from the rails through the floor and into my chest. The pulse of the line resonated in perfect sync with my own heartbeat. It was a rhythm I could feel, understand, and follow. The doors hissed open automatically, mist curling in like a tide. I could step out, join the others who had been absorbed, become part of the rhythm, or remain at the controls, sustaining the pulse of the endless line, guiding it, observing it, becoming one with it. The first step toward the platform felt natural, almost irresistible. I placed my foot down onto the glowing surface, and the air around me seemed to ripple with acknowledgement. Light and shadow folded around my form, brushing against the edges of my awareness. The vanished passengers flickered briefly at the corners of my vision, their presence folded into the terminal structure. Their silent observation reminded me of what had been, what had become, and what I now was. Yet I turned back toward the cabin. The train awaited, humming with expectation, its pulse steady, eternal, alive. It was no longer a vehicle, but a living extension of Terminal Zero itself, and I was the keeper, the observer, the last conductor to sustain its rhythm. Every lever, every gauge, every glow of the rails was now connected to me. The line was infinite, the terminal eternal, and I had become inseparable from both. The mist thickened around the train, curling like fingers across the windows, yet I did not flinch. The line pulsed beneath me. The spectral figures drifted along the edges of perception, guiding, waiting, ensuring that the rhythm of existence continued uninterrupted. I exhaled, steadying my hands on the throttle. The rules were no longer words on a page. They were the heartbeat of the line, the pattern of life and absence intertwined. The intercom whispered one final time, softer than ever, a note that resonated inside my mind rather than the air. The pulse continues. The line endures. You are the observer. You are the conductor. You are the one who stays. I gripped the controls and felt the energy of the rails, the pulse of the train, the endless presence of Terminal Zero flow through me. I was no longer simply a conductor. I was part of the line, bound to it, sustaining it, ensuring that every living and vanished passenger, every shadow and shimmer, every flicker of the infinite route continued to exist in perfect rhythm. No, the train surged forward, not toward a destination, not away from the past, but into the endless, eternal heartbeat of the line itself. Outside, Terminal Zero stretched infinitely in all directions, filled with those who had come before and those who would follow. Inside, I remain at the controls, eyes fixed, hands steady, pulse synchronized, forever guiding, forever observing, forever a part of the ones who stay. And so the line continued, endless, eternal, alive, and I, the last conductor, became its living rhythm, the pulse of the train, the keeper of Terminal Zero. The journey had no end, only continuation, only observation, only the eternal presence of the line itself, carrying me forward forever into the unknown. Welcome to the ones who stay.